The first time they laughed, I thought it was nerves. Mine, perhaps theirs, maybe a misstep in my presentation. Rome had that way of making you believe the history pressing down on every wall meant something noble waited just out of sight, if you could impress enough of the right people in the right room. But this room was small and full of shadows. There were 6 of us circled around a cramped table in the old Testaxio Artists Collective. My data sculpture, transparent acrylic threads bisected by copper wires, each intersection marking a century of rainfall and migration across the region, stood in the center, glowing faintly where my borrowed desk lamp shone through its fragile core. The theme was echoes, but even now I can only hear the bray of Enrico's laugh bouncing off the cracked plaster. Rain patterns, migration, you want people to pay to look at that. He smacked the back of his hand against Daniel's arm. It's like staring at spaghetti with a spreadsheet on top, al dente algorithm. I tried to smile, my tongue was sandpaper. Giovanna snorted, pausing mid-sip of her espresso, her shoes scraping at the floor. Seriously, Lucia, you have the whole of Rome around you. This city breathes art and you come with statistics. My palms stuck to my thighs, the data was more than numbers. I wanted to show how the city's veins, its people, its storms, its tides, shaped what we called history, but in that cage of giggles and pointed looks I shrank. It takes vision, I said, though my voice wobbled, to see what's under the surface. Art isn't just marble and oil, it can be. It can be boring, Enrico cut in, waving his hand. Sorry, but it's true. Nobody wants to see a bunch of charts unless they work in insurance. The room exhaled, ready to move on, and I felt shame flush up my neck, burning. Even the light from the lamp looked dirty. I packed my fragile web of threads and copper into the box as quickly as I could, each motion robotic, each word of vague encouragement compounding the humiliation. They dismissed me as gently as a child's found rock. I carried that box down the steps, out into the Vespertine Roman buzz, and stood beside the curb, watching the city lights flick through drizzle. 2 weeks later, my mother called. I'd submitted my portfolio to a digital art residency in Berlin, desperate to escape, to prove to myself that my work meant something beyond this ancient cobblestone echo chamber. Lucia, are you still wasting your days with that computer stuff? The line crackled, but her sigh was clear enough. You're 28, maybe it's time to come help your father at the bakery. Good, honest work. I'm not giving up. She sniffed, and I could picture her shaking her head, hair tied back beneath flour and resignation. You need to think about family security. Nobody gets rich with, what is it, numbers shaped like pictures. I ended the call and stood in the kitchen until the walls blurred. I was too angry to cry, too numb to argue. I wanted someone, anyone, to see what I saw, the flickering mosaic beneath the Roman everyday, the silent story in cables and rainfall traced through time. But the truth was that mostly they didn't. When the rejection email from Berlin finally came, I felt more relief than grief. At least now I didn't have to keep pretending that brilliance lurked just one more application away. I boxed up my art, threaded, wired, imagined, and slid it beneath my bed. I took odd jobs teaching children to use Photoshop, graded exams for an online university, and stopped answering my family's calls. Rome buzzed around me, always 3 paces ahead, always reminding me that I was not quite enough. That year, the Tiber flooded twice. I walked with wet shoes from Trastevere to San Lorenzo to tutor a man who wanted to turn his wine bar's receipts into viral infographics. I felt invisible, maybe I wanted to be. One afternoon, as I sipped burnt coffee in a corner bar to avoid the rain, an advertisement flickered on my phone. Open call. Data as art in the age of crisis, Paris. I almost scrolled past, but the idea clung to me, an exhibition that saw data not as the end, but as a starting point for emotion, for memory. That night I sat on my narrow bed with my knees up to my chin, the city outside alive with scooters and distant baritone chatter. One by one, I pulled out my old pieces, untangled the threads, and let myself believe for an instant that I could try one more time. I spent a sleepless week mapping the Tiber's pulse across centuries, how floods changed neighborhoods, carved new lines of poverty and privilege, how weather and policy, beauty and bureaucracy twisted through my city like rivers within rivers. My laptop overheated. I burned through half a month's savings on plexiglass and postage. When I shipped the model off to Paris, my hands shook, but the old hope, fierce and small as a match in a storm, persisted. Summer rolled around, sticky and golden the way only Roman summers can be. Half the city emptied, but I stayed, listless and restless, waiting for nothing. It was my brother who messaged first. Lucia, got a letter for you. Paris stamp, want me to open? All at once my stomach clenched. A week later I was standing in a white-walled Parisian gallery, air full of soft conversations and cool light. My piece stood at the center, taller now, glinting threads tensely strung, LED pulses tracing invisible patterns, river blue and copper gold. People circled, peered, leaned close. Is this rainfall? Wait, migration patterns? They didn't laugh, they asked questions. A woman from Lyon gripped my hand and wanted to know if her family's village had been swept up in the flood lines. A journalist scribbled notes and asked about the wire choices, the colors. I heard the word emotion, I heard revolution. I heard, finally, myself reflected in other people's voices, not as a punchline but as an origin. The exhibit ran for a month. A German art magazine featured my work. I was invited to Dusseldorf, to Lisbon, to talk about cities as living rivers. Money followed slowly, but more than that, invitations. For the first time I belonged somewhere, in that hungry, borderless web of artists who saw beauty in silent numbers. Back in Rome, though, my family barely understood. My parents watched from behind the counter as customers brought in clippings from Italian design blogs. My father would mutter, "Looks like tangled up junk" to me, even as he clipped each mention and shoved it in a drawer. I tried to visit, but the gap between us felt wider than the Tiber at flood. My friends Daniel, Enrico, even Giovanna had changed little, still doodling frescoes or painting trite cityscapes, rolling their eyes at new media. I stopped inviting them to my shows. But the ache of home, of being seen, never faded, not really. 3 years passed. I let my hair grow out, learned to wear black in Berlin and red in Madrid, always the outsider observing, making sense of cities through patterns, always collecting fragments. My Italian grew raw at the edges, flecked with English and German, and sometimes I dreamed in code, lines of color and shape instead of language. Then, last winter, Yannis, my agent, sent me a message. Biennale di Roma is taking proposals for city-based installations, up for it. My heart, stubborn bastard, leaped. Home, it whispered. Rome, the city that shrugged when I sweated, that mocked me when I tried. I worked for months, tuning my installation as if it were an engine. I gathered municipal climate data, stories from old workers at the markets, children's crayon sketches of rain. I built a maze of filament and holographic projectors so that visitors would walk through the Tiber's history, rivers of light, sounds of ancient rainfall echoing above. When I shipped it all to the Biennale warehouse, the tracking info made my hands clammy with fear. The press release came out in May. Internationally renowned data artist Lucia Bartolini returns to Rome for a landmark fusion of technology, memory, and city. Half breathless praise, half blank confusion. I was scheduled to speak on opening night at the Palazzo dell'Esposizione. I called my family. My mother handed the phone to my father, who grunted, "You need help with parking." I said I'd manage. The day of the opening, I woke before sunrise in my old apartment, which I'd sublet from a friend while the city was still new and strange. The floor creaked underfoot. The sky was burnt peach, traffic barely stirring outside. I pressed my palms flat against the damp glass of the window to steady myself. When I arrived at the palazzo, tech teams were wrestling with cables. My old friends Daniel, Enrico, a handful of others drifted in, drawn by the Biennale's prestige if not by my name. My parents arrived near dusk, my mother wringing her hands, my father immaculate, reluctant in his only suit. The main hall was packed, all velvet ropes and nervous chatter. Rome's art world, curators, critics, tourists, an old history teacher of mine I barely recognized. The installation waited, a maze of floating wire and light, voices swelling up from embedded speakers with every step. When the doors opened, they rushed in. My father squinted, hand tight on my mother's elbow. Enrico and Giovanna hovered by the edge of the maze, smirking, arms crossed. Then the first ripple moved through the crowd. People stopped in front of my piece, mesmerized. When they entered, the projectors triggered. Rain stitched across the air in blue thread and silver digital spray, sound recordings weaving with poetry, Roman dialect, weather stats, immigrant stories sliding through speakers layer by layer. Enrico's laughter faltered, then died. I watched him catch sight of his own face mapped years ago in a festival crowd, shimmering across a wire, transformed by code into color. He turned, mouth half open, no words. Daniel stepped toward the maze's core, surrounded by a constellation of historical rainfall figures, childhood photos melting into storm maps, bewilderment softening his scowl. A pair of critics knelt to examine the copper filaments, whispering to one another. A child darted between beams, giggling. The data responded, a printout unfurling from the side with her new rain fingerprint. Old and young circled, tracing impacts from their neighborhoods, finding their families, their histories in the flow. My mother's hand fluttered over her lips. My father touched one of the wires with uncharacteristic delicacy, as if waiting for it to snap. Giovanna approached me. Her eyes darted between the glimmering maze and my face. Lou, this is really you, she swallowed. How did you? I almost laughed. Piece by piece, I said softly, year by year. People wanted photos, interviews, explanations. Someone from Rye asked about algorithms. A city official said children should see this in every Roman school. The overflow line stretched out the door, and for a moment, as the room whispered with awe and my heart pounded with quiet vindication, I saw those years of loneliness crystallize into something undeniable. Proof, weighty and light at once, impossible to ridicule. My father sidled up beside me, surveying the crowd. His eyes were dark and hard to read. You made all this. I nodded. He patted my shoulder once, awkward, as if I was still a little girl. You did good, not what I imagined for you, but good. It was all I needed. After the show, Enrico clapped me on the back too hard. Well, I'll be damned, Lou. Didn't see it before, but you've got the whole city talking. I met his eyes, searching for the mockery. There was just confusion, grudging pride. Giovanna hugged me, whispered apologies, and said she hoped to see more. As the crowd thinned and moonlight slid through the windows, I stood in the pulse of my installation and let myself breathe. Not as a stranger, not as a punchline. Home, even if they'd never understand every wire or whisper, they felt it now, the weight, the possibility. My shame had become my courage, my struggle, my success, but I knew I didn't truly belong to any one place, not anymore. I carried cities inside me, places I'd mapped through data and memory. Yet as I left the palazzo with my parents, as the maze of light faded behind us, I felt Rome settle around me, less like a stone and more like a river, carrying me home and forward at once.